Hiyuki is coming to Wuthering Waves next week, but considering the fact that Menjo is coming soon, should you really be pulling for Hiyuki? That's what I'm going to be talking about in today's video by discussing her biggest pros and cons. The first thing I want to mention is the fact that Hiyuki is an incredibly rare Glacio character. The last Glacio 5-star to release was Carlotta in version 2.0, which, fun fact, is not just a year ago, it's almost a year and a half ago. So if you're trying to grab up a Glacio DPS, Hiyuki is obviously not only going to be the best bet, but most likely also going to be the only bet for another year. I don't know why Kuro is gatekeeping Glacio so insanely hard, but it seems to be the last for everything. It was the last element to get a limited 5-star main DPS, it was the last element to get access to their negative status, and even then, because Hiyuki has a special negative status, you still won't be able to use the normal Glacio Shafe. And then there's the obvious over 1 year gap between her release and Carlotta's. So overall, when it comes to Glacio, Hiyuki might just well be the best chance you're gonna get at a Glacio DPS in a long time. Especially since the last time we saw Carlotta was version 2.6, and even then, Hiyuki is going to eclipse Carlotta in terms of damage output anyway. Now, while I don't consider attributes to be a very important part of the game, it's still a pretty good idea to have a decently varied roster of attributes on your account. If you only have 5 Spectro main DPSs, then you're going to be absolutely annihilated the second the endgame resists Spectro. So having at least 3 attributes with good teams on your account is a very good idea to make sure you can always keep clearing. There's also not that many Glacio-resistant bosses in the game, with only the Lampy Lumen Myriad and Sentry Construct resisting Glacio from what I'm aware of. Maybe the Nightmare Kelpie also resists it, but they have not been in endgame so far. So ultimately, when it comes to bosses, Glacio resistance is incredibly rare, so there's a lower chance that you're randomly going to be countered. The second big pro for Hiyuki is that she is going to be a very good character for anyone who likes Chisa, because Hiyuki is going to be the first DPS where getting Chisa is an actively good upgrade for them. Imeth would technically have been the first, but Denia is releasing after Hiyuki, so technically Hiyuki is first. This is because Hiyuki is a negative status DPS, and she's not just about raw damage either. Whenever Glacio Shafe is triggered and Hiyuki is in the team, it will instantly deal damage based on the maximum amount of Glacio Shafe stacks that you currently have. Which means that Chisa's ability to increase the stack cap for every negative status by 3 is very well enjoyed by Hiyuki. This is also helped by the fact that, while Hiyuki does do a lot of negative status damage, she also has a lot of personal damage. Which means that Chisa's signature weapon, as well as the Threat of Bane effect, are very good for Hiyuki. And there is not some kind of Arrow Rover situation here, where Chisa is only slightly better and she's mainly a comfort pull. No, she is actually noticeably better than the next best option, which would be Mornia. And once we get Lucilla, which is the Glacio Shave sub-DPS, the gap is most likely going to be widened even further, which means that Chisa is going to be an actually good pickup for Hiyuki. This also leads me into my next point, because usually when you get a negative status character, you would assume that they need their full premium team. However, Hiyuki is one of the exceptions to this. While it is true that Hiyuki is a negative status focused DPS, there is a couple of reasons that she doesn't specifically need a negative status sub-DPS, one of which being the fact that she applies plenty of her own negative status, which means that you don't need someone else to apply it for you. Additionally, all of the mechanics in her kit that incentivize running other negative status characters are mechanics that only benefit the negative status part of her kit, which means that if your team isn't centered around the negative status in the first place, you're not going to be missing out on much. If you're playing Hiyuki with Lynae and Mornia, you're not going to notice much of the Glacio Shafe aspect of Hiyuki's kit, which means that she is going to be completely fine running as a bog standard hyper carry, which is very nice for everyone who has the pulls to get Hiyuki and wants to get her, but isn't sure if they're going to be able to get Lucilla. So ultimately, Hiyuki not being locked to a certain type of character in order to do good damage is very good, especially with how Zani and Cardothea completely fall apart once they do not have their Phoebe or their Shikona. And even Imeth, who has Resonance mode, if you want to play her in a Fusion Burst team, you kinda need Denia. Because a Lynae Chisa team is actually better on the Toon Rupture mode than it is on the Fusion Burst mode. So ultimately, the fact that Hiyuki is going to be completely fine running Lynae Mornia is something very nice for this character. Now obviously it's going to be less effective in Whimpering Wastes because Toon Rupture damage is based on the enemy class. However, I feel like the team is still going to be strong enough for Whimpering Wastes to the point where you don't actively need to invest into Chisa and Lucilla. So ultimately, it's still going to be a choice whether you want to invest further into the character. I do think it's going to be a good idea because Hiyuki with her full team is most likely going to be incredibly strong, as well as the fact that Lynae is an incredibly contested unit. But the fact that the investment is a choice rather than a requirement is something that's very rare among negative status characters. Something else that's really interesting about Hiyuki is the way her ultimate works. Whenever you use her ultimate finisher, she is able to consume stacks that increase the damage. However, you're not able to actually cap out the amount of stacks during one rotation. In fact, it's physically impossible to gain more than one stack during your ultimate window. You only get one ultimate stack whenever you use Bitter Frost, and in order to use Bitter Frost, you need to use Frost Hardened EI 3 times. And guess what? You are only able to use Frost Hardened EI a maximum of 3 times when it comes to Hiyuki's ultimate, which does mean she is locked to 1 stack per rotation. But the cool part is that Kuro is completely aware of this. They designed her numbers around 1 stack, however you're not forced to consume these stacks. Consuming these stacks is a choice from the player, which means that you have the ability to save all of your stacks until you have 3 of them to completely nuke a boss once it spawns, giving Hiyuki a very unique amount of utility when it comes to multi-wave within Tower of Adversity. The initial waves of enemies can be cut down with 0 stack ultimates and the rest of her damage, but then the second a boss spawns in, you're able to completely unload every single stack at once to just completely nuclear bomb them, which gives Hiyuki a pretty interesting amount of utility in multi-wave content. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and Hiyuki has one big flaw, being the fact that at the time of her release, she kinda needs to run Lynae. Lynae is one of the most contested and powerful characters in the entire game, so the fact that Hiyuki really wants to run this character is incredibly damning, especially since Lynae is the best in slot for the most popular DPS in the entire game, which is Imeth. You can't even use the Fusion Burst excuse because both Hiyuki and Fusion Burst Imeth want to run Chisa. So you're gonna need to nerf one of your characters if you want to play Imeth and Hiyuki at the exact same time. And the only way to mitigate this going forward is by getting Lucilla and to run Imeth Toon Rupture. However, Lucilla is not a character in the game yet, and since she's most likely coming out next update, that means that you're gonna need to get Hiyuki and then also pull the next patch's 5-star, which might be pretty straining on your resources. So ultimately, you're gonna have to consider if you're okay with running Hiyuki and Imeth at different times and not using both of them at the same time. This gets even worse if you play characters like Luke or DPS Yuno. So you really need to make sure that you are able to spare the Lynae and use her with your Hiyuki, and that you have alternatives for your other DPSs. Because if you don't, your Hiyuki might be a bit homeless for a while. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, if you have any questions, be sure to join my Discord, which is linked in the description down below. But that'll be all from me. Peace.